Welcome back to another episode of the CSK8 podcast. My name is Jared O'Leary. Each episode of this podcast discusses computer science education by either unpacking a publication in relation to CS education or by interviewing a guest or multiple guests to talk about computer science education. In this week's particular episode, I'm engaging in a conversation with Laura Discenza. In our discussion, we chat about advice for getting started with learning how to teach CS. We also talk about speaking with arts educators about the intersections of the arts and CS. Both Laura and I have degrees in music education. We do have some background in that. We also discuss a class called the Genius Hour, which basically allows you to regularly incorporate the 20% free learning or creating time that organizations like Google are known for. 20% of your time is to work on what you want. In this case, they created a whole class on it. We also discuss avoiding overly scaffolding learning in the classroom, as well as the importance of having fun with CS in elementary school, and so much more. We do mention several resources in this particular episode, which you can find at the show notes by going to jaredoleary.com, where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of free computer science-related resources, including a link to bootuppd.org, which is the nonprofit that I create coding curriculum for. 100% free, and I think there's about 100 projects on there right now, so make sure you check it out if you haven't. But with all that out of the way, let's now begin with an introduction by Laura.
Hello, my name is Laura Discenza. I am going into my 6th year teaching computer science, 5th year in my current school. I'm at Davis Academy in New Haven, Connecticut. We are a public magnet school for kindergarten through 8th grade. And it's been great. It's been a lot of fun. So excited for the new school year.
Can you tell me the story of how you got into computer science education?
Absolutely. So it's kind of a roundabout. When I was in college, I actually wanted to double major originally in computer science and education, but in the state I went to school in, we weren't allowed to. You had to have a double major in a liberal art. It couldn't be in one of the sciences. So wound up in music, still loved it, but kind of put that computer science on the back burner for a while. And then was teaching general ed 4th grade, wound up in a science position, and they cut the position and tech opened up and I jumped at it because I've always loved computers, loved teaching it, loved kind of being a part of it, and fell in love and never looked back. So was very lucky to get a position in the school I'm in now to kind of start the program from scratch because they never had a computer science teacher before. So it's been a lot of fun kind of making this program what I want it to be.
Has that changed? Can you now double major in CS and education or?
So I went to school in Massachusetts, and in Massachusetts, it still has to be a liberal art major.
Why?
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So unfortunately, that's not a program. There are schools who are now offering specific programs that are computer science education. So it's not a separate major, but your double major has to be, at least in that state, something in the liberal arts family.
That's interesting. I have a lot of questions for whoever came up with that, but that's for a whole separate podcast. So then how did you learn computer science?
A lot of trial and error and a lot of honestly learning with the kids. So being an elementary level, I definitely had a little more leeway with that. It kind of started off with one year I got an email about the hour of code through code.org saying, try this with your kids. I was like, you know what, this looks like fun. I went to a Catholic elementary school and we had a teacher who was definitely way ahead of her time. And she started doing HTML with us with 7th and 8th grade, but we had to make websites about the 10 Commandments and the Beatitudes. And, you had to link it to a website. So clearly in my glory, I linked a Beatitudes website to the WNBA website because that's what was most important. And kind of love computer science and tech. So when I saw the code.org, I was like, oh, I love doing this when I was a kid. I bet these kids will too. And the hour of code took off. We had kids talking to their homeroom teachers, them wanting to get involved more. And I was like, you know what? Let's see if this is feasible. Let's see if this is something I can make happen. And wound up taking the code.org's classes for teachers and their week-long seminars and kind of falling in love and learning how to do it and taking the courses myself to learn it and grew the program from there.
So I too had a lot of self-taught or taking a Udemy course to learn how to program apps on iOS, things like that, just to try and supplement because I didn't have this kind of education in the music education degrees that I got and whatnot. But I'm curious because it has changed over the course of, since you've been teaching the last 6 years, what would you recommend for somebody who's interested in getting started now to start with it? Would you recommend the same path or are there new advancements or new organizations that you point to and say, hey, start here?
I think it really depends on where you want your courses to take you. So I truly believe for the younger grades, code.org is a great place to start because it is leveled. You can start with as young as kindergarten. But depending on what your experience is and what you're comfortable with, there are other sites. So I know for our kindergarten, we really liked using Codable because you didn't really have to know any language. It starts you off with, what direction does this character have to go in? And kind of having teachers too understand you don't need the advanced degree necessarily to introduce these concepts of coding to kids. It's more than just, well, what does the bracket mean and why is there a slash here? Get the basic fundamentals. You need things in order. You need things to make sense and flow in certain directions or loop, and then grow from there. The other part is don't be afraid to learn with your students. Don't be afraid. It shocked me what some of our fifth graders were coming up with in some of the more advanced courses. I mean, they would code these games. I'd look at it and like, yeah, I wrote it out. They said I was learning how to use Python. I was like, cool. That's amazing. And let them explain to you what they did and learn from them and ask them questions, because not only are you learning more, but now it's pushing them. And it really is great. I mean, the first class I had that was coding in fourth and fifth grade are now eighth graders. And seeing those projects evolve over time is just amazing.
So if you were to travel back in time and give yourself some advice and like, hey, here's some of the things that I really wish I knew when I got started, but learned later on, what would be some of those recommendations or advice?
Don't try to do everything at once. We got bombarded. We were very lucky that we were kind of in a grant position. So they're like, what tech do you want when you're starting this new position? And kind of went in a bunch of different directions. So we did, robots and coding and Bloxels and this and that and the other thing, which is great. And right now I love having them, but it was definitely very overwhelming to start. So, it's okay if you have 4 different grade levels that are kind of starting at the same spot, because when that younger class gets older, now you can add on those next things. Everyone does need a starting block. Don't expect a fifth grader to be able to complete a fifth grade course just because it says a grade level when they've never had tech before. So it's okay to start small and let it grow. It will happen. Just give it time.
Yeah, I had some people who would come into my classroom and see like, oh, there's all in the same class, like 4 different programming languages going on different platforms, devices, etc. And like, they would look at that and go, I can't do that. And it's like, well, you didn't see the progression that led to this. Like I started with one language and then next semester, okay, I'm going to add in one more option, etc. So like you can grow. So I definitely would second that. Don't overwhelm yourself right off the get-go.
Right. And also there's a ton of resources out there depending on your state. So for Connecticut, we haven't really adopted computer science standards. There's some that are out there, but they're more library and media standards than computer science. And our tech class specifically isn't just computer science, it's also just technology as a whole. So, we do engineering projects as kind of part of it, and we have different things. So know that, if you're not coding the whole time, that's okay. You can still include those computer science concepts in other things you're doing. So, they're writing algorithms for coding a snowball when they had a snow day. That's still coding to them. That is still an activity that is adding on to those experiences and getting the information in their brain about how things work and how things need to go to make a program run.
Yeah, and it's connecting it with the everyday, like in the moment. But knowing that both of us have a shared background in like music education, I'm curious, how do you approach those intersections with the arts and computer science?
So we have 2 different platforms that I really like to use, especially with the music. One is using the microbits. In our classroom, because you can code them out to do different sounds. The new ones that were released have speakers right built into them, which is amazing. We unfortunately don't have those in our building, but we can connect speakers. So the kids, are making songs together. The other thing that we have, it's a newer program or newer company. They're called Unruly Splats. I don't know if you're familiar with them.
No.
But they actually integrate the music and kind of physical education in with coding. And they're little bricks. I think I have one I can grab that the kids can jump on, smash on, stand on, run around to, but you can code them either using a MIDI player or just straight kind of using an octave tonals and make songs. So the kids, they're learning this song in music class. Well, let's see if we can code it. How much time do you need between a note? How long does the note have to be? How do you make it so if you're playing the A on this one and the B on that one, how are they going to interact with each other? So that's been a lot of fun and it's great. So in our school, we have things called majors and minors for our 5th grade students and up. So what it means is once they hit 5th grade, they pick what specials they want to focus in on. So if they pick technology as a major, they'll have tech twice a week. And if they pick music as a minor, they'll have music once a week. So you're kind of getting these kids in different tracks, and it's cool how they might all take the same tech, but then use it within their other specialty. And we have a lot of music tech crossover. So it's fun to see those kids kind of work together and be like, look at this song. It sounds better than when we played it on the drums. Just, okay.
Yeah, I haven't heard of it phrased as majors and minors. That's interesting. I'm all for like having multiple pathways for students to kind of specialize in things. And if they want to, okay, you can take a generalist approach and just kind of sample here and there. But like forcing everybody to do that, it just, I personally didn't like it going through school. Like I wish I could have taken more music classes instead of being limited to the number that I had in like high school. But that's my own biases. I'm curious, from your perspective, what do you think that CS educators and arts educators can learn from each other?
It's a lot of commonality that isn't discussed. You know, in music, you have a set pattern that you're going to follow, and that's how you get to the end. And if you don't follow it, the song isn't going to be the song. You're writing a program. If you don't follow it and put it in the right order, the program isn't going to run as a program. And a lot of the terminology is the same or very similar if it's just discussed. I'm very lucky, again, in my building, this isn't the case, but I've seen a lot of schools where people are very territorial about their subject areas.
Yeah.
You know, music teachers are going to stick to music teachers and tech teachers are going to stick to tech teachers. And they're not willing to have that communication about, well, how can we make this one? And when you do that, I mean, it opens so many doors. You know, maybe there's a kid that's in the tech class that's never played an instrument before because they could never afford it or never had the opportunity. But now you're doing this crossover and you find out they're a gifted musician. They have natural rhythm. They have natural beat. Look what they can do. And they might not have ever had that opportunity to express it before. So I think that's another thing of just opening those doors for the kids to see the other side of some of these kind of specialty areas.
And express themselves in a way that they couldn't do just in like a large ensemble class. Like there are so many cool things that you can do that you can only do with that intersection of like the arts and code, like making things randomized. So like I created like a randomized drum set. So it creates like a random beat and fill forever. And I have no idea how it's going to sound when I change it to a different seed to start it. Like that is something that I can't do on drum set by playing that. So it's like this different way of exploring music and computer science. I have a lot of arts educator friends who are honestly afraid of losing their job because they're usually low priority compared to other subject areas. One, because it's not like required, they're not part of the standardized tests, etc. Computer science is also not part of the standardized test. However, there's a huge push for it, like nationally, because of all the unmet jobs and things like that. So it's at least a higher priority than some of the arts classes. But how do you speak with other arts educators and music educators to help kind of quell some of those fears of like, no, we're not replacing you, but to also show like, hey, here are some of the beautiful things that you can do with computer science that relate to what you are doing in the arts?
Again, I'm in a very unusual situation with my building in terms of our magnet school is arts and design innovation. That is our focus. So our entire staff is very aware of the fact of we are trying to integrate these two things into every subject and into every class.
Cool.
So it gives us that conversation starter of how to do it. In my previous school, though, I was very lucky. The art teacher and I were very good friends, and it was cool to kind of get that crossover and explain how, you know, if we work together, look what these kids can do. And also bringing that back to the homeroom teachers of, you know, we're not just here to give you a prep period. We're here because there's skills that are needed for you to use in your classroom as well.
Yep.
Kind of showing that crossover, I think.
In some of the conversations that I had when I was in teaching coding class, when I'd speak to the music teachers and be like, well, how do you explore music through it? And it's like, well, you know, there's all these standards outside of performing, like all of the composition standards, history standards. You can explore a lot of those through code, but also you can explore just like diving into a better understanding of, well, what is rhythm? What are pitches? What is timbre? Why does that matter? And like thinking of Sonic Pi, which allows you to code live music or compose music that you just hit play and then it runs on itself. Like there's so many neat things that you can learn in that or reinforce that also connect to it. So like I had kids who would come in, they'd bring their band method book into their class for like trumpet, and they just rewrite their favorite songs in code. And that would help reinforce like their understanding of pitch and rhythm, etc.
So for us, one of the cool things we did this summer is the art teacher that's at my building and I were both part of another summer professional development, which highly suggest to anyone who does maker classes or anything. It's the Pathfinders Summer Institute, but specifically the Maker Educator Collective Boot Camp. And it's kind of how you can get making into every single aspect of teaching, no matter what you teach, how can you make it a maker class? And we got into talking because we were starting to use Turtle Code. I don't know if you've seen that program, but pretty much you can put out different shapes and there's a little turtle on the screen that'll draw out the designs. And you're talking about how cool it'd be for the art students who are talking about symmetry and shading and line design, so then be able to code their design and then print it out on our laser cutter. And there's your connection. You've got your tech piece, you've got your art piece, you have these kids who are doing that integrated design, and they can bring it back into their classroom to make classroom decorations. It's all right there. And just her excitement as well, going like, oh, I don't have to be my own silo anymore. This really can be a whole school event.
And is this typical throughout the district? Like, do you have other magnet-like schools, or is this like a special case? Because your school sounds awesome.
Yeah, so we do have a lot of different magnet schools in our district. There are, I believe it's 42. I might be slightly off on the number of schools in our district. I believe there's about 20 that are magnet, but everyone has different themes. So there is another school that is science and education. There's another one that's multicultural. So it really depends on the building at what theme they take. Ours, we're coming to the close of a specific grant that changed our focus from being just art to that art and design. So I kind of, again, was very lucky and hit the jackpot in my placement because it very much aligns with my teaching methods and what I like to do with my kids.
Yeah, and speaking of, one of the things that why I think your school is so awesome is we had a previous conversation talking about Genius Hour at your school. So I think it was the Birds of a Feather when you discussed it for CSTA's conference. I'm wondering, can you share what is the Genius Hour?
Absolutely. So the Genius Hour in our building, it's kind of based off of Google's 20% time. So the whole concept is giving students time during their school day to do passion projects. So it can be almost anything under the sun in the older grades. In the younger grades, we kind of tailor it a little bit more to teach them the process and have them understand kind of how to work through their own project, from topic idea to questioning to research, all the way through to whatever their final product is. It's definitely been eye-opening the last few years, and it's been really cool seeing what some of the kids have come up with. It's also been, a learning curve for teachers trying to figure out, how do you make this work? The most surprising thing was how some of the students struggled being given that freedom and not being told, oh, I have to make this thing. No, you can make whatever you want. You can turn this into whatever you want. Okay, but what do you want me to do? No. You can literally do whatever you want to solve this problem or solve this idea or learn more about this.
Yep.
Our process right now, we have relied greatly on the book Launch. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's John Spencer is one of the authors for it. So it's called The Launch Cycle. And it's built off of kind of the design thinking process. It's the same standards. It's just put into an acronym so people can remember it a little easier. And that's what we've used. And it's been great for them because it gives them kind of set spots to get to within their project, but it's still self-guided. So, we might have one person on step 1 and someone else on step 5, and that's okay. But they kind of have that framework of how to work around to get to a final product.
Okay. I'm really curious, how did this class get added to your school's offerings? Was it because of the grant, or what's the story behind that?
It kind of started because of the grant. We wanted to be able to give students more design process and design thinking, and this was the way that we decided to integrate it. There was a lot of discussion about, let's just make it more science classes. Let's just do more, experimentation. But it was kind of that's not really design. That's, telling the kids, do these steps, do exactly this, you're going to get this result. What did you see? Which is great. That is very important. Being able to do that is very important. But we really wanted to give them student choice and kind of student accountability over what they were doing, and give them that freedom to go, your ideas do matter. Your thoughts and your process do matter. But let's put that into something so you can share it with the world.
So how has COVID impacted this? I'm assuming your district went to virtual teaching for at least part, if not full-time, for a portion of this last school year. So did this Genius Hour, did it continue in some capacity, or was it expected or not expected?
So we did do it all the way through. It definitely changed a lot. And I can't really say for better or for worse. It was just very different. And I think for some students, it was a lot more feasible for them and they didn't get as overwhelmed. For other students, they really missed that hands-on activity portion. So, in years past, we would get to the create part of the launch cycle and my classroom would look like a hot mess. I mean,
yeah,
organized out of organized chaos. There was just everywhere, but it was great. There was creation. Whereas this year, we couldn't share supplies. We couldn't do this. Half the kids were home. Half the kids were in school. Starting in January, we were fully remote. Until then, it was, you can make something, but you got to find the stuff at home. You can bring it in if you want to make it here and leave it in a corner, but there's nothing I can give you to make this creation. As a result of that, though, some of them got creative, and we got talking about, making something doesn't mean you physically have to build it. You might be making a podcast. You might be writing a book. You might be making one of the kids really liked video games and decided he wanted to make a video game guide for a game that didn't have one out yet. And he researched how to put it together and what should be included and how do you get it published. And he created, chapter 1 of the first level of the game as his product, as his prototype to present to the class. Cool. That's awesome. We had other kids who were physically engineering something, but in a prototype state out of the stuff that they found at home. So it kind of opened their eyes a little bit to the creation doesn't necessarily mean one thing. A creation can be anything that you want it to be, as long as you can present it in some way. That's kind of our only real rule here.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I love that example of creating like the walkthrough. Like that sounds like a project that I would have done in an instructional design course, like having done similar things where it's like, okay, either create or refine this existing walkthrough of how to do something like a work order or worked example or whatever. If somebody's listening to this and like, this sounds awesome, we don't have anything like this in my school, what advice might you give to them? Or another framing of this could be like, if you were to switch schools all of a sudden, you get reassigned somewhere else and they didn't have it there, but you wanted to get it started, what would you do to get something like this started in a school?
I would definitely start with a single grade level and have it integrated into a class some way. So one of the easiest ways that I've seen it integrated is science, just because they have some more of those hands-on things for people to kind of see and buy into. But there's a lot you can do within your ELA class, which we like to do with our younger students, reading them a book and picking a problem from the story and having the kids create some kind of solution to that problem. And start small. Give the kids kind of those leading questions and give them their jumping off point. And then as you go, now make it more open-ended to them, being like, well, we gave you the problem last time, but now what's a problem you see in your classroom? Or what's a problem you see in your house that you can fix? Whether it's, our can opener doesn't work. I don't like feeding the dog. Something small, and then grow it out to be kind of on a bigger scale. So we're currently doing that school-wide, where the younger kids are given the issue, the middle age group are given the topic, and then the older students are just, pick something. More than likely, our 8th graders next year, they can pick anything within their major topic. So the idea is it's going to kind of be a capstone. So, you're a music major, something to do with music. You're a drama major, something to do with drama. And then from there, let their minds go. But definitely, don't be afraid to start small and give those jumping off points, because it's going to help them understand the process. And then as they get comfortable with that, you can give them more and more opportunities to explore it.
I would have loved something like that in my school. The idea of starting small, letting it expand from there, kind of treating it as like a prototype. Maybe that can help get more people on board once they see the success that's going on in that. Like that really resonates with me. Thinking about a podcast that recently released that was talking about like students with disabilities and how some kids do really well in these like open freedom, create whatever you want. And then other kids need that like step-by-step instruction, and they struggle with that kind of agency or freedom. What kind of advice would you give, or how might you approach those kind of students who are having difficulty with that?
So we have a few in the building. I have some that immediately pop into my head. And the biggest portion of it is know your kids and know what they need. I have one particularly, he needs a visual aid. And as long as I have something of, this is what you did last time I saw you, this is your goal by the end of today. What could that look like? Having, 2-3 minute conversation with them about what's going to happen today. At the end of the day, grab it, make sure that it's logged. I have another student who independently can't work as well. So if they're doing a project, if their idea happens to be similar to someone else's, maybe their seat got moved and they happen to be at this table now, and they can mimic off of what another student is doing or how they're processing. It's not going to be the same project, but they can kind of see the steps the other student is taking. So it really, know your students and know how they're working. It'll make all the difference. And one of the other things I love, again, I'm promoting this, I wish it was a sponsor, but the launch cycle, there are so many great resources. There's videos on each different step of it, as well as there's worksheets available. There's a breakdown of how to break it down to students with different learning disabilities out there. It's an amazing resource. Highly, highly recommend.
Yeah, and I'll make sure to include links to it in the show notes. If I were to flip the question, so I was asking like, what advice would you give? What would be something that you'd recommend avoiding or not doing?
Hand holding.
Mm.
As teachers, sometimes one of the hardest things is giving up control and letting the kids really take something, even if you can see, the bottom of the pit and the explosion already going off and the kids don't see it, let them have that moment. Timelines are another thing for teachers. It's one of those like, well, I have to have this project done by this time because grades are coming.
Yeah.
It's part of a control that has to let go. So in our building, we decided as a whole, it is not a graded class. It's a pass fail in terms of, did you show up and try to do something? Or did you sit there and go, I don't care at all? That's really, because, how do you grade someone on something that they're passionate about and they're trying to make? It's going to go differently for every kid. So kind of giving up that control and going, it is what it is and it's going to be okay. They're going to learn so much more by something exploding on them than they are just being told, no, you can't do it that way. Just do this instead. Let the explosions happen, metaphorically and physically.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of, I think it was in 2 different podcasts we talked about it. One was with Kristen Stevens-Martinez and another one was with Shuchi Grover. So we talked about like assessment and then like grades. And I shared how my class was basically what you described. Like, are you in here and are you working? If so, cool, you keep an A. Like if you're in here and you're just goofing off, cool, you don't keep your A. Like as long as you're actively working towards something. I'm not going to tell you what that is. You get to determine. I can help you, but I'm not going to force it upon you. But because there's no like fixed deadline of, hey, you have to finish this by this week or this particular quarter, like it allowed kids to work on massive projects that some of them spent multiple years on. And because they didn't have to worry about like being able to stop midway through and go, okay, I want to change my mind. Like they really got to explore and learn new things about themselves that they didn't realize they were interested in.
Absolutely. It's funny to see some of the students too, because they'll come up to you and be like, what do I have to do to get an A? Well, what do you mean? Well, like, what's the rubric? What do I have to accomplish today? Don't worry about that. Just learn, just explore. No, but I need to know how to get the A. I'm like, that doesn't exist.
Have you found that those questions are less frequent the longer your school has been doing this?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a mindset. So once they realize that we aren't here to penalize them, we're not here to keep, close eye. Oh, you didn't do that exactly right.
Right.
It's also the cooler the projects become because they're willing to take those risks knowing that it's going to be okay.
Yeah, and I asked that because it was a similar thing. Like the first year I started doing this in the K-8 school that I was in, it was a lot of questions like, well, what do I need to do? Like, where's the rubric, etc. By year 4, like those questions were only asked by the kids who like transferred into the district and who weren't used to this kind of class. But everybody else who had been there had been like, yeah, this is the class to like explore what you want. And like there was a waiting list to get into the elective version of it, etc. But the people who transfer in, they're just like, I'm not sure. What's the catch here? Like, are you going to fail?
Absolutely.
So if we were to think broader than just this particular class, which sounds awesome, and you were to design like your own ideal learning environment, that could be anything you want, like wave a magic wand, boom, you get it. What would you design for? Like, what would it look like? How would it sound, etc.?
Legos everywhere. No, I'm going to be perfectly honest. I have almost my ideal setup now. We were very lucky and kind of got new tables and stuff. So just a lot of space for students to collaboratively learn and grow together. So whether it's, grabbing Chromebooks and figuring out how to code something out, or they're grabbing the, Bloxels cubes to build a new video game, or the splats or whatever it is, and giving them that freedom to explore different realms of either technology, or if we're in Genius Hour, whatever their topic is, in a comfortable space for them. So, if I have a kid who just needs to lay across the floor and have things, cool, you do that. As long as you're learning, as long as you're communicating and having that communication. I am lucky in the terms of there isn't really another classroom around me. I've got the gym down the hall and the library where they don't really house classes. So these kids can get as loud as they want to. And the rule is, I don't care how loud you are, as long as you're on some kind of topic that can trace back to this. You might be talking about SpongeBob, but it's because you're trying to animate something in Scratch and you want it to, cool, that's fine. That's perfectly fine.
Right.
But how's the time back? And from there, have fun.
Yeah, I wish I had a professor who one time was like, why isn't whether or not somebody enjoyed a class like a standard that we actually strive for? Shouldn't kids walk away enjoying education? And because that's not something that we focus on, isn't that pretty telling of what school is going to end up doing to students?
Absolutely.
So speaking of negative things, my apologies, listeners. What do you feel is holding back the field and framing it into a positive? What can we actually do about that?
I think one of the negatives is the consistency. I know in RC, I mean, even in our district, there are 3 of us who are computer science teachers in the entire district specifically. Most of our schools don't even have a class. So then the kids get to high school and it's, well, I don't think I want to take that. I've never done it before. Why am I going to jump in now? Or never even heard what that is. So we're limiting the number of students, the number of people interested just because it's not available and it's not consistently available. Or, they'll transfer in from another school that has computer science, but their entire computer science course is learning how to type and only typing, which again, great skill, something you have to do with the younger students, but they don't have any other background because that's all that's taught. Getting more tech into the buildings in terms of tech teachers, I think is great, as well as different ways of interacting with it. It's not just having a Chromebook so they can write the paper. It's having a Chromebook so they can learn how it works, learn how it operates. It's growing. It's definitely growing. You can see by the numbers of people online and in different forums and groups, but especially at the elementary level, just getting that consistency so we know that every kid has at least experienced it or been exposed to it, I think is our biggest challenge right now.
Yeah, that really resonates with like the core mission of the nonprofit that I work for. Like we're trying to get CS in all the elementary schools and make it so that it's mandatory. Like everybody can do it. And I think that can really help with some of the sunk costs that can go into, well, if I haven't taken this class for the first like 8 or 9 years of my schooling, now the risk versus reward is much like more challenging because I've done these other things that I know I like, and there's this new thing. I don't know if I want to give up something that I know I like for something that I might like. But if you can just dabble in it, even for like a year, like when it's not as high stakes, like I took soccer in elementary school and basketball, and turns out I didn't want to be a soccer or basketball player. Like it was fun for that year that I did each of those, but I didn't want to do it forever. Now, had I not tried it and I got into a high school and I was in band, which I knew I loved drumline, but I had this like opportunity to have to switch to something else. I'd have to give up something that I knew I enjoyed. For all I know, I could have been, I don't know, a soccer player. Like when it comes to CS, it's the same thing. Like, okay, if we don't offer it early enough, then kids won't know, and they might just say, well, I don't know, maybe I'd be interested in it, but I think I'll just stick with this other thing, even though it might end up being like their passion.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head there. And we see the numbers right here. So I mentioned the major and minors. When our 4th graders are at the end of the year, they have to kind of rank what do they want their class to be. And we try to keep the computer science class to around 18 kids just so we can pull out the robots we have and this or that. And we had almost 35 kids sign up this year instead of all of them just going to choir, all of them just going to band, because they've experienced it since they were 1st and 2nd graders versus the grades before they had it for half a year in 3rd grade and that was it.
Right.
So, I mean, the data's for us is right there. It's exactly that.
Yeah, that's good. You're able to actually look at that and compare it. And again, this major minor thing, my wheels are still spinning. Like, I just think that's really cool. Adding that with the Genius Hour, like, I wish more schools had that opportunity to do that for kids being able to develop individualized expertise in something that's interesting to them.
It's great to see. And it's amazing what they can do when you do have a class as well that's excited to be there. You can get a lot more done and a lot more advanced when you've got a group of kids who are there because they want to be there and they're excited to be there versus I'm taking this because I have to take it because it's the 45 minutes a day I'm told to sit in this classroom.
Right. The scary thing though is like from an educator standpoint is at least from some teachers that I worked with is they're like, well, what if I don't know an answer to that? And it's like, well, because kids are developing individualized expertise, like they can talk to each other, like to get some questions answered, or, okay, we don't know the answer to this. Let's explore it together. We'll learn together.
Let's figure it out. Absolutely.
Which building off of that, like you mentioned how you got started and kind of taught yourself CS and like taking some workshops and whatnot, but how do you continue to practice? Like also being a musician, I know you know what the grind is like in order to actually improve on the areas that you need to improve with your voice or instrument or anything. But how do you do that with your pedagogy or with your understanding of CS?
It's a lot of honestly continued seminars, or I do rely highly on the code.org work and continuing on and getting into their AP courses and taking those individually on my own or on my own time. I'm currently trying to work in C programs because right now computer science teachers do not need to be certified in computer science in Connecticut for the elementary level. And I'm trying to work on having that because I know it's coming down the pipeline. So finding programs that are local that aren't ridiculously expensive to try to get that certification and get those classes. So kind of that mixture of the collegiate level and what's out there for students and teachers mixing it together and hoping for the best.
Speaking of hoping for the best, like hoping for the best for this upcoming school year, but we talked a little bit about this, like some of the struggles, but how do you try and prevent that burnout that can occur just in education in general, but especially over this past year with everything that went on with COVID?
Definitely making sure I take time to do my passions as well. So on top of teaching, I'm also a high school basketball and volleyball coach. So having that time that's almost scheduled from August all the way through March, that's, I've got at least 2.5 hours a day in the gym with the high school kids and playing with them and coaching them and focusing on that. And then I'm a crafter too. So making sure, maybe I'm doing this project for the kids, but let's have some fun and do it for myself. So taking that time away, but also knowing that I am prepared. We've been through worse. It's going to be okay. So let's just see what we've done and what we can make better or adjust for whatever situation we're in. So, we're in person full time. Great. I can use the 3D printer that's in my classroom, or I can use, the doodle pens. We're remote now. Well, maybe we get cardboard and we try to make our own 3D structure out of it. It's going to be okay. The kids are still learning the concepts and the ideas I want them to learn. It's just in a different forum.
Yeah, I like that. It's like making the best out of what you have, but also approaching it from like a this too shall pass. One of the things that's been frustrating to listen to is like hearing some people frame this as like the lost generation. It's like, okay, we can all take a break from learning for a year, even if like kids just like didn't engage at all with school for this past year. They can still be fine. They can still continue to learn things. It's not like they're now never going to be able to learn again. Yes, it was unfortunate, but there's many cool things that they can still continue to do and learn.
Mm-hmm. I've seen it on memes. I've seen it everywhere. The only people that are writing about being concerned that kids are a year behind are the ones looking at test scores. We made those rules up. Why can't we change those rules?
Yeah.
I think to myself, this entire building didn't have a tech program before I came, and what they were doing was learning Google Slides. That was tech class. So they're still years ahead than they would have been if they were in 4th grade or 2nd grade 5 years ago. It's okay. We're going to catch up. They're going to learn what they're going to learn. They're going to have fun with it. That's all that matters.
Yeah, and the having fun with it part, like even if they take a year off, if they come back continuing to do something they learn, I would be willing to bet they would be further ahead than if they never had a year off and they were learning stuff they didn't care about because it'd be irrelevant to them, so they wouldn't put in the effort.
Absolutely.
That's my own pedagogical bias and whatnot.
It's fun to see with some of the little ones. So I had Genius Hour for kindergarten last year, and we were making ridiculous things. And there was one particular student who school was a rough time for him. Very energetic kid, sitting in one spot was not meant for him. It's one of those kids. And we were talking about roller coasters, and their project was to try to make a roller coaster out of whatever Legos they could find in their bin. Well, it turns out this kid apparently found what he fell in love with. And from then on, if they needed him to talk about a story or something, he just had to have Legos in his hand and he would build out what he was doing. He'd be able to express himself through whatever creations. I'm like, you know what? He might not have been able to actually make the roller coaster, but we found something that he can express himself in and help him refocus in class. That is a much bigger and important lesson learned in my book than what I was trying to get at that day.
Yeah, I love that story. Shifting gears a little bit, when it comes to like equity and inclusion in CS education, do you have any advice that you recommend either for veteran CS educators or teachers who are new to CS?
So I can't speak to the high school level, which I know a lot of those situations come on because it's an elective versus, here we're in elementary school, it's a lot more controlled and contained. It plays into that student interest. So showing students that, computer science isn't just, one little hole that you have to go through, that specific things, and you're only doing, it's not all Star Wars and Lego building necessarily. It can take on whatever form you want it to, and portraying it to students that way, showing students how computer science fits into so many different facets of life, because I think that's going to open a lot more doors to people who might not consider themselves a computer scientist or aren't interested in the field. I know Girls Who Code do a lot of work with that, and there's a bunch of different organizations out there. I definitely can't name them all, who have a lot of great programs to help promote more of that equity and more of that inclusion, which is wonderful. In terms of the special ed, again, there are a lot of great programs. I might have a student on different levels because intellectually they can't handle what's going on in the general ed class, but they still feel included. They're still on the same site. They're just leveled differently, or certain controls are adjusted, and they can still succeed. One of my top students is labeled autistic, and it is absolutely phenomenal what they come up with. And it's just, that's their niche. They found their excitement. And their parent was concerned about them even being in the computer science class because they thought it'd be too much for them to handle. So making sure that they have that opportunity to try it and have that moment, because I promise you they'll surprise you.
Yeah, we found that across a lot of our districts as well, or especially kids in special ed, like parents or teachers, there'll just be some concerns. But yeah, some kids are just able to just completely run with it when you would think otherwise. Like we have a video of the teacher who took over the classes that I was previously doing in the K-8 school. So when I was there, he was the 4th grade teacher. And when I left, he ended up taking over, and he's said that it was an eye-opening experience for him because he was able to see some of his prior students that he worked with who had struggled in his like ELA class just absolutely thrive and excel in CS. And he's like, it's the same kid, same teacher, just a completely different subject area, and night and day in terms of difference on how they would be able to do in it.
Another area that I don't think gets talked about enough are our ELL students, and the joy on some of their faces, because for some of them, especially the younger ones, it's the first time they feel like they can truly communicate with their peers, because the code language is the code language. Our kindergartners, we use arrows and stuff a lot because they aren't readers yet. So they can code through a map. They can be the top of the class and be proud of what they did when they might struggle in other areas because they can't read the directions. They don't know what's going on. They can't understand. Code.org, again, it's in a bunch of different languages. So this is just a fun story. We had a student who was a refugee from Syria and spoke Arabic at home, was learning English as he went along as a 5th grade student. And on code.org, you can change the language. So he put into Arabic. However, it changed the whole screen over to their alphabet, which reads backwards and on the opposite side of the screen. So he comes up to me, he goes, I need help. And I look and I'm like, well, I don't even know what you're on right now. What is happening? But then couldn't figure out how to transfer back. So now we're trying to match up screens with someone else. But it opened conversation with another student. I couldn't figure out where he was at, but another student knew the screen, and they're talking through and showing, and they're now best friends 3 years later. And it started in that classroom together, being able to work together in their own languages, both be successful together and work together to succeed. So
yeah, from an accessibility standpoint, like having that ability to just toggle any language just on the fly while it's running is definitely helpful. And I say that as somebody who is very much so struggling through learning kanji for Japanese. I know some individual kanji, but then you put it in a paragraph and I'm like, I have no idea what it's talking about. That right there says water, I think. I'm curious, thinking of research that can inform not only just the pedagogical practices, but specifically in CS education, what do you wish there was more research on that could assist it with that?
I think development at the younger ages. There's not a lot out there at all about, developmentally what the kids can succeed with and what they can understand and process at the younger level in terms of computer science. I mean, there's the step-by-step, there's stuff that you can pull in terms of language development to help transfer over, but there's mostly research that's done for middle school and high school levels. There's not a ton out there for the elementary kids.
Yeah, I'd second that. I know there's people who are doing it, but we need more.
Yes.
What about, what's something that you're working on that you might be able to get assistance with? Like if there's somebody who's listening to this, and you're like, I really wish somebody would help me with blank. What would that be?
I had mentioned this before, this program didn't really exist before I got here. So I've been building it from scratch. So kind of creating that vertical planning across the grade levels. I'm still figuring out, what stuff should fit where and which grade level. And it's trial and error. We're starting year 6, but a year and a half of it was in a pandemic. So that threw everything we did before out the window to an extent. And it was a different plan. So kind of if people have great roadmaps of what they might have done in lower grades through upper grades or what has or hasn't worked, I'm always looking for ideas and articles and research out there about how people are running their programs through elementary schools.
So I will share this in the show notes. San Francisco has a scope and sequence that I frequently point to and say, hey, here's an example of how you might be able to do this in elementary school.
Oh, awesome.
So we've actually had several districts in different states like ask a similar question, like, well, what does this look like in terms of vertical alignment? How do you like scaffold in the different standards, etc.? And San Francisco had some really awesome people on a team work on this a few years ago. So it's a good starting point at the very least. It's easy to find alignment with most state standards if you're fortunate enough to have them, because most of those state standards are at least based off of CSTA's work.
We're working on it out here. We're getting there.
So then where might people go to connect with you and the organizations that you work with?
So I have a Instagram and Twitter account, a brand new one for tech. I decided after this past Pathfinders that my, AIM screen name that I had since 5th grade was no longer probably appropriate for professional teaching. So we're slowly transferring over. There's not a lot there yet. So at TechMakeTeach with underscores in between. If you want to find my old one that has a bunch of projects over the last few years and some random basketball pictures, it's LMD B-Ball Rocks, because again, 5th grade me was really cool. And again, they're both on Twitter and Instagram. I'm also out on Facebook just with my name, so feel free. I post a lot of my tech stuff there. And then we've got a Donors Choose page up. We were lucky enough to get a laser cutter in our building this past year. So much fun. But we need a cart to put it on so the kids don't get, crushed by it, saying on the floppy table we've got. So working on getting that for them so we can roll it into the classroom so these kids can start making their projects.
And with that, that concludes this week's episode of the CSK8 podcast. Make sure you check out the show notes at jaredoleary.com so you can visit Laura's Donors Choose page, as well as check out the other resources on the website and in the show notes. If you'd be so kind, please consider sharing this episode with another colleague or friend, or consider leaving a review on the app that you listen to this on. Stay tuned next week for another episode, and until then, I hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.